When you talk about music, you talk about it in that way. You talk about it as a function of sound. And one of the great things in the book and one of the great things about your work, the other day on Desert Island Disc, do you know Desert Island Disc, that thing they have where people choose 10 records? Mm-hmm. Well, they had Annie Lennox, and she said that she believed that Dylan and Leonard Cohen were the first people to bring music, rock and roll music, and poetry together. And then we were talking, I think she missed out someone who we mutually feel was possibly even more poetic, and that's Jim Morrison.
Yes, but I also, Jim Morrison, of course, probably the most important in terms of merging poetry and rock and roll. But there are degrees of poetry. You know, sometimes one can, if you trace poetry and performance, you can go back, for instance, to Rachel Lindsay. You can go to the jazz artists or somebody like Oscar Brown Jr. And Kerouac improvising to piano. A lot of the jazz musicians and the beat poets. You can actually go all the way back to Solomon or King David, who were writing poetry and singing them. Because aspects of poetry, William Blake wrote poems that were like songs.
Well, made into songs.
But Jim Morrison brought in other aspects because he was a real performer, a great performer. He was a shamanistic performer. He channeled the people and he gave back to them. And he was also blessed with being a true poet, which is, you know, people aspire to be a poet, but Jim Morrison was a poet. It was like he was branded like Cain was branded. He was, by God, declared a poet. And so he gave to us, even in his few albums, the highest of poetic language merged with rock and roll.
Say a bit more about this shamanic, the shaman, as a poet, and as a singer, and as a... I mean, I don't know whether people know, but you have American Indian blood in you. Fred, your husband, was quarter Cherokee. And there's very much a shamanic element in the way that you wrote poetry. And then when you brought music into it, you kept it in that kind of tradition, very simple and direct.
Well, it's because performance is collaborative. It's for the people. People often say to me, well, what's the difference between writing a poem and writing a song? The process is different in this way. When you're writing a poem, you're really most concerned with the elements of poetry, with the god of poetry. It could be God, it could be Apollo, but your muse. It's a very almost selfish, self-contained, solitary communication. But performance is nothing without the people. It's all about communication. It's all about commune, sending energy, receiving energy. It's like a figure eight. You pour out to the people give back to you. Jim Morrison was the king of this process, but also James Brown was pretty good too.
Yeah. And Jimi Hendrix, you were saying, had this element.
Jimi Hendrix was like a god, you know. But the thing about Jimi Hendrix is Jimi Hendrix was a very shy man, even though he was very ritualistic. Jim Morrison was, I believe, a more shamanistic performer because he was very, he sent out. He wasn't afraid of the people. He was, you know, almost there to be devoured as well as, you know, to give. But
when you told the Electric Lady, going back to Jimi Hendrix being the opposite, that he was so shy that what did he do when you recorded him?
Well, I was talking to people that recorded him, and he has so much duality because on one hand he could
flamboyant
and physical, and on the other, he was so shy that he would have the windows covered in the vocal booth because he didn't want people looking at him when he was singing.
That must be very difficult for public performance.
Well,
you have to have a door in front of him.
And I would see him, like, living in New York in the 60s. You would often see him in a restaurant or something, and he always ate like this. He always had a hat on. He would be horrified, like in our present culture, with all the cell phones and pictures, and he would be horrified, I know, because he was just the kind of person you would not go up to him, because you could feel that it wasn't just that he was like a snob, it was painful for him to have to relate. But yet, he gave his all on stage. But I think more important, I mean, Jim Morrison was a performer. I think Jimi Hendrix, had he lived, would have been more concerned with developing movements, musical movements. He was more humanistic, peace movements, and also developing another level of musical language to take everything he knew from jazz, from from rock and roll, and also what we look upon now as world music and all the merging of different cultures was still burgeoning. It was still young then. Brian Jones, of course, brought us the pipes of Pan. The Beatles brought us the sitar and Indian music, but it was still young. And Jimi Hendrix wanted to further explore this and see what possibilities of a global communication through music, the discordant aspects of music becoming harmonious.
And it's